The stage of Atlantis was a mess. Those animal men, those cavemen, had no thought as far as anyone else went. It was working, it really was working, but then again, in another way, it wasn't working. Remember, these thought forms were unisexual. They were a combination of both sexes. They had the quality of both sexes in their makeup, but the animal bodies, the cavemen, were either male or female in one body. Therefore, there was both the male and female spark in the male body, and also the male and female spark both in the female body. There were fights like you wouldn't believe. There were perverse sexual acts taking place. This was the stage of Atlantis. It was a mess. Even Michael himself could not control it. He had lost all control. Having both parts, male and female, in the same body, made for not only very wise, knowledgeable, creative entities, but at the same time created many warped minds with twisted sexual appetites and weird sensational ways of appeasing them. In the same body were genius qualities, and at the same time the most retarded in this one area of development, the sexual drive. No one living today can imagine some of the things they thought to do with no feelings of right or wrong. There was no conscience of any kind working in the area of sex, and this area carried over to all phases of life in Atlantis. It covered every aspect and influenced every action. Michael felt he had to do something. He decided that he was going to almost have to start over again, only with the refined caveman instead of clear back to the early animal. But Michael had to have this done because the cavemen were going to destroy it themselves if he didn't do it, so he cleaned it up. When this devious manipulation got carried too far, drastic action was needed, because once again humanity was at the point of destroying itself. At this time, the restructuring of the form took place, brought about by the sixth round of inseminations at approximately 10,000 years ago, or 8,000 BC to bring it into our time frame. Drastic action was needed because humanity was at the point of destroying itself. Having both halves of the spark together was indirectly the cause of all that went wrong in Atlantis, but was not seen as being the cause until one member of the hierarchy took on a body and descended into that nightmare, leaving his female half out of the incarnation, in other words, as an experiment to see if there was control available. It worked. More volunteered to experiment this way, and the decision was made to start creation over in this manner. The split of the spark into positive and negative, or male and female, Adam and Eve, biblically speaking, was when the whole form was restructured. It was determined by Michael the Oversoul that it did not work for the two halves of one spark, the male and female halves, to be in manifestation at the same time, as there was no control, no system of checks and balances. New rules and regulations were needed concerning the entering of bodies. Beginning at this time, half of the divine spark was all that was allowed to enter the form. The other half had to stay on the inner planes and control the half that went into the body. The fall of man referred to in the Bible was at this time, when half of the divine spark was all that was allowed to enter the form. This was caused by the devious behavior of mankind at this time period, mostly deviation in sexual behavior. To clean up the mess that was Atlantis, Michael asked for help again from an even older brother who had gone on to another galaxy. This brother sent help in the form of storms that practically destroyed this beautiful earth. The story of Noah and the ark has not been as misinterpreted as most, but has not been considered from the angle of help from other planets. The earth was indeed shifting on its axis then, as it will do again soon. The rains that came then could not be prevented. Noah was commanded to build the ark by the Space Fathers. They didn't want to see eons of hard work be lost and have to start over. This was the time when Atlantis disappeared, the same way our west coast will go. The most evolved humans were in Atlantis at that time, and the loss of this civilization would have been a major setback for planet Earth. The people were removed over a period of 50 years or so. Noah was the one chosen to bring an experiment into fruition by preserving only his own family, because his children were the first to be the split halves of the soul. But when it got closer to time, the Space Brothers realized that the animal kingdom was, indeed, also more evolved in Atlantis and needed to be saved. This was also part of Noah's task. He was to save a pair of each species so they could reproduce and the animal kingdom could continue as it was. There were other survivors in other parts of the world, but not in the particular area where Noah's flood took place. The inhabitants in other parts of the world soon went back to the inner planes, and when reincarnated, were also then split sparks. There were many of these floods throughout history. There will be another one soon. It is due to cataclysmic action of the earth. Noah did indeed reach Egypt, and the ark was torn apart, dismantled on purpose, and burned, as it was unusable for any purpose after that due to the droppings of the animals. The most advanced of the cavemen and the most advanced of the animals were saved, and he started his creation over, the biblical story of Noah and the ark. By the time Atlantis was destroyed, the spacemen needed to know if superior nutrition would help create a more thinking, reasoning human. Thus, experiments with nutrition had been started. The Garden of Eden was an experimental growing station to give more nourishment for the evolving animals. On the sixth day of creation, the spaceships came from outside our solar system. This was when many, including the First Lord or Captain, came from the constellation Norma. Some also came from Clarion, and some from Edentia, which is where the man Eden came from, the planet Edentia, to start the experimental garden. These were more advanced solar systems than where the help had previously come from, which had been from planets in our own solar system. As man evolved out of the ape stage and started walking upright, the ships would bring certain foods and chemicals to use on selected specimens, leaving them in their natural environment, but giving them this special help. The plant life native to Earth was crossbred with specimens brought from other planets. This is where most edible fruits and vegetables came from. Very few were native to the Earth. The spacemen set up a controlled environment growing station, so these supplements did not have to be transported from other stars, the biblical Garden of Eden. The garden was begun at the same time as the restructuring because it was realized that this nutrition was going to be responsible for a large part of the refinement of the forms on this planet Earth. The garden was a huge mass of land that managed over a period of about 300 years to really increase the brain capacity of these humans. This growing station was an experiment to give more nourishment for the evolving animals. The volunteer in charge of these experiments was truly a genius in his field. His name was Eden. His stay on Earth was of 300 years, until he felt he had stabilized the crops and done the most that he could to further the nourishment of the race. He did eventually return to his home star, Edentia, in the Pleiades. As given, the garden was an experimental growing station for producing more highly nutritious fruits and vegetables than the Earth was able to produce at that time period. By this time, the conscience in man had started developing. Michael had exerted enough control in the days of Lemuria that these early cavemen did start developing a conscience. Some of them had continued using this conscience into the Atlantean age, but not nearly enough of them. The ones who did continue to expand his conscience were the ones that were saved when Atlantis was destroyed, as they were the more highly evolved of the race. The garden was located in a country known as Israel. It was a large plat of ground near the Sinai Desert that was irrigated with a tremendous irrigation system bringing water from the distant Nile River. There is still evidence of this system to be found if excavation were made at strategic points. On the eastern bank of the Nile River in Egypt, near the town of Bethane, there is a masonry standard that bore the weight of the pipes carrying the water as it was siphoned out of the river. The pipes were of a near leather-like material made from the skins of sheep. The pipeline followed the river until the point where it meets the Jordan, then crossed at this point into present-day Israel, the biblical land of Canaan. The promised land was the Garden of Eden. They were one and the same thing. The irrigation system used was quite elaborate for its day, having these pipes of sheepskin crisscrossing the growing station with punctures in them and the ability to close the water off at the top of the hill. There are several of these pipe bags preserved in a cave in a hillside near the town of Judea. If evidence is wanted or needed, a dig could be done there. Eden stabilized the crops and did the most he could. After 300 years of trying and experimenting, he had pretty much come up with the right combination in his seeds, the right hybrids of seeds, and so on. The growing of crops as done in the garden was planned to perfection, to get the most out of the soil that they were grown in. But this didn't carry out into the outer fringes of civilization. These seeds were given out and the tribes planted them, but they didn't do it scientifically. They planted the same crops over and over again in the same fields and drew all the nutrients from the ground in that one area. Then they would move on to another area, and after practically devastating that piece of territory, they'd move on to another. This just kept going on. It's still going on today. This is what has happened in present-day Africa. There simply weren't enough advanced beings to get all the help necessary to all the people. This is also true today. There just simply aren't enough advanced beings to spread them thin enough to get help out around to everybody. This has been the problem right along. Up until that time, the food on Earth did not have a lot of the vitamins and minerals that were needed to increase the thinking capacity of the animal brain. As given, this was the purpose of the garden. Many experiments were brought in as far as food goes, which, by the way, will be what will happen when we go into the fourth dimension. There will be much experimentation with food products, food growing, and with food interchanging of components, etc., in a new experimental garden, nature's mineral garden. The earthmen who ate from the garden did indeed receive knowledge, but of course not from the biblical single bite of an apple. It was a process covering many generations. Later generations were told of the progress made by those who ate the fruit and produce of all kinds, to induce more people to plant these crops and eat the harvest, so more growth and intelligence could take place. Some of the items brought from the other stars could not be grown on Earth. Some could be grown but had disastrous effects on humans. It was found that with the addition of seaweed, the process of thinking was speeded up even more. This brought about the biblical tale of Jonah and the whale. It was thought that the best way to use the food from the sea was by eating the seaweed itself. The astronauts tried to tell the people that by eating the fish they would get the same results, that the fleshy part of the belly of the fish was a reservoir of selenium, which is the chemical that is found in seaweed. The gastrointestinal mechanism of the fish processed the seaweed automatically and stored the byproduct selenium. If the people would eat the belly of the fish, they would gain the good nutrition just as easily and in a tastier fashion than eating raw seaweed. Can you imagine trying to get unevolved man to understand this concept? The captain of the spaceship determined that the best way to set up the experiment as far as better nutrition was to take one tribe and divide it instead of using two different tribes. The house of David was one of the 7 original tribes known as the Jewish race. This is why they were called the chosen race. They were chosen, but there was no particular honor in being chosen. In fact, there was a good deal of sadness because some of the family units of the original tribe were broken apart. The original tribe that was split was from the house of David. One half would eat the fruit of the garden, the other would be kept outside of the garden. This would assure them that there was no difference whatsoever in the two groups. If they used two different tribes, there could have been biological differences due to the location in which animals grew from the amoeba and many other factors of heritage that would throw off the results of the testing. This testing was to determine if the thinking capacity of those eating from the garden improved within that very generation, or if the results of better nutrition would not show up for one generation or more. The split of the group broke up families, which left a heart-wrenching sadness in these animal men. The two halves of this tribe had all received the same genes, but one group was chosen to be the benefactors of the experimental garden, the other group not. In other words, one half of this tribe was a test case. They were not allowed in the garden. There was no difference in this experiment from what our scientists today would conduct in a laboratory. This was after the 5th round of inseminations at the beginning stage of the Garden of Eden, at the time of the restructuring that took place after Atlantis. This also was what instigated the practice of circumcision, so in case one of those outside the garden tried to have his way with one of the women in the garden, she would know immediately that he was not one of her kind and could protect herself from his advances as best as she could. If he had his way with her anyway, the baby was destroyed. The Space Fathers wanted nothing contaminating the half of the tribe that was kept in the experimental garden. The half that was not chosen for extended experimentation with breeding and nutrition were circumcised so they would be known. This was the basis for circumcision because the other half of the chosen tribe was so close in looks, actions, genealogy, and so on at this time that instead of branding their skin like you would do with cattle, the act of circumcision was initiated to differentiate between these two halves of the same tribe. The half of the tribe put in the test garden was not circumcised. This half, when they were eventually released from the garden, were the ones referred to as the Amorites. This has caused much confusion, and it is a misinterpretation that needs to be cleared up. The tribe was split in half, and the half that received insemination of genes from the spacemen were kept apart from the other half and fed nutritional food from the experimental growth station. The half not put in the garden was circumcised so they could be told from the half that had been inseminated.